Hello guys, this is a video for functional anatomy and we are looking at the topics in the muscular system, and this is the first of two videos that looks at how our nervous system works with our muscular system to control muscle contraction. And you can see by the title there, neuromuscular process of muscle contraction. This video is going to consider what an action potential is and how that action potential travels across a neuromuscular junction. So this is the specification content for this video. Again, it's looking at what is an impulse or an action potential, what's a neuromuscular junction, and you will need to know a specific neurotransmitter that has a function at a neuromuscular junction, and this neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine, or ACH for short. So let's see how the nervous system interacts with the muscular system. So in a lot of your sports, there may be objects that you have to watch out for, make contact with, there might be other players you have to keep an eye on. Ultimately, your senses take in information and your muscles are made to work according to what's going on around you. But we've just got to look in a little bit of detail in this process. So as I've already said, the neuromuscular system combines your nervous system, your nerves, your brain, your spinal cord, and your muscular system, the muscles that sit on your skeleton and ultimately allow us to move. We take sensory information in from our senses. So, for example, the tennis player might be watching the ball in either of these examples. The eyes act as senses, and the information about the ball is sent via sensory neurons to the brain. So sensory neurons carry information from senses to the central nervous system. Central nervous system is our brain and our spinal cord. Your brain decides what to do about the ball and will send an impulse or an action potential along a motor neuron. So a nerve that goes, an impulse that goes down your spinal cord and out along motor neurons, nerves, to your muscles, and ultimately will make certain muscles contract in specific order for you hopefully to either catch or hit the ball. So we know from this that our nervous system is a communication system and that our muscles need some kind of nervous stimulation, or innervation is an even better word, to make them contract. So these electrochemical impulses or action potentials are sent along nerves to the muscles to make them contract. I've already mentioned our central nervous system, so our brain, which is basically our computer and our decision-making center, and our spinal cord, so the two sort of organs here in orange are our central nervous system. But also we have these nerves branching to and from the central nervous system, and those are the ones that we want to know about anyway, are sensory and motor nerves. Now these are categorized broadly as peripheral nerves. So the peripheral nerves are all the nerves that go to and from the outside of our body, so all over our body. And we know that we've got sensory neurons and motor neurons. And here is a diagram of a typical motor neuron. So we've got the cell body, the nuclei, the axon is the darker orange strand going through the middle there. This motor neuron is myelinated. We'll learn a little bit about that. Myelinated neurons mean that the impulse travels faster along it, which is a really advantageous thing. And the impulse actually jumps over these sort of fatty layers there and gets to all these nerve endings where it will make contact with nerves. And the impulse or the action potential then will travel along this motor neuron and then spread through the muscle fibers, hopefully making them contract. This is a sensory neuron. So from sensory receptor cells, an impulse is taken probably to another neuron, ultimately taking the information to the brain. So I guess the key bit of information so far is you've got a central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord. You've got a peripheral nervous system, the nerves that go to and from the central nervous system, your sensory neurons and your motor neurons. Let's just clarify then what an action potential is, or an impulse. The words can be used interchangeably, I guess. I think it would be good practice to learn action potential. So an action potential is an impulse or an electrochemical message sent along a neuron to innervate, that means to make a muscle fiber contract. Essentially, again, if this is the cell body, this is a bare axon, so there's no myelin on this motor axon. This axon up here has got this wrapping fatty sheath around it. It's called a myelin sheath. And that acts as an insulator, and that means that this neuron is myelinated. So if an impulse is going to travel along this bare axon, it will kind of chug along like a slow freight train. And you can see by the polarity here, the pluses and minuses, that the membrane, inside and outside the membrane, will change in polarity. It will depolarize as the impulse travels along. So having to do that all the way along this bare axon means it's quite a slow process. If a motor neuron is myelinated, like this one at the top, what that means is that depolarization, the change in plus and minuses, you can see there, this is where the action potential actually is traveling that way. It can't do that where there's a myelin sheath. So the impulse actually jumps to the next bare bit of axon, and then it will depolarize there, and it will jump to the next bit of axon. It will depolarize there, and jump and jump and jump and jump and jump, which makes it actually much quicker transmitting this action potential impulse along that neuron. So there's a bit of language to learn. Myelin sheath is a fatty insulator. It kind of blocks the depolarization. The bare bits of axon in between are called the nodes of Ranvier. The impulse is an action potential, and actually there's a posh phrase for how it jumps. It's called saltatory conduction. But I guess the most important thing for your spec is, what is an impulse? What is an action potential? It's an electrochemical impulse that communicates or transmits along a motor neuron to make a muscle fiber contract. Then we've got to look at what happens at the end of that motor neuron, where you can just about see the bottom of a motor neuron here. So this is the end of the motor neuron. This is the last little bit of myelin sheath. This is the axon in the middle. And we've got basically a junction where the motor neuron meets a muscle fiber. So the vertical bit here is the motor neuron, and the horizontal bit here is a muscle fiber. We can kind of see that it's striated or striped, which we know. There's a microscopic version over here, so you can see the neuron and the nerve endings, multiple nerve endings, and these big purple lengths are muscle fibers, and that's this diagrammatic version here. What isn't brilliantly clear on this diagram, but you might be able to sense, is that where the nerve ends, the yellowy, bluey line, there is actually a gap between the nerve and the muscle, where these dips are here. And the impulse, the action potential, comes down this motor neuron. It's got to get somehow from the nerve down into the muscle fiber across that gap. The posh name for that gap is called a synapse, or a synaptic cleft. And we need to understand the process of how an action potential gets across that synapse and spreads in the muscle fiber. So this junction, this neuromuscular, neuromuscular junction, is where an impulse has to get across the gap. So here are some other diagrammatic versions that sort of show it a bit more simplistically. Here's the end of the motor neuron, here's the synapse, the gap it's got to get across, and here's the muscle fiber, which we want the impulse to spread down in, is another version over here. So I'm going to talk through the process on these diagrams first, and then I'll show a slide which gives a written text version of the process. So we've got an action potential that's arrived down this motor neuron. Now, can you observe these bluish blobs here? They're the equivalent of these blobs with dots in it here. These are called vesicles. These vesicles contain a very important neurotransmitter. So again, there's a clue in the name, neurotransmitter. It transmits a nervous impulse for us. And the name of the neurotransmitter that's inside here is called ACH. I'll show you it written in full in a moment. ACH. It's called acetylcholine. So these are basically sacs containing ACH. When the action potential arrives down the neuron, or comes along this diagram down the neuron here, what it does is it makes these vesicles move towards this membrane here, this end membrane. So these blob vesicles will move towards this membrane here. We would describe this as a presynaptic membrane. Pre as in before the synapse, presynaptic membrane. When the vesicles arrive at the membrane, as you can see on this right-hand diagram, they open up and they release that ACH. And those molecules of ACH will essentially carry the impulse, carry the action potential, transmit the action potential across the gap, across the synapse, into these receptor sites. They look a bit like teeth, really. So again, the vesicles will move towards the presynaptic membrane, release the ACH. The ACH goes across the diagram, across the synapse, into the receptor sites here. And if enough ACH accumulates in these receptor sites, then the action potential will spread down these T tubules and make this muscle fibre contract. So that's kind of the story. That's how it gets across the gap. We've got the action potential coming down the motor neuron. We've got the vesicles that are made to move, carrying the ACH towards the presynaptic membrane. They release the ACH, which is transmitted across the synapse, carrying the impulse, the action potential. And if enough gets across into the receptor sites, the impulse will spread down the muscle fibers, and the activation, the excitation of the muscle fiber will occur. So let's look at that in text form. So we've just got the same diagram but sideways here. Okay, so the motor neurons all coming sideways. There's the ACH going across the synapse into the receptors of the muscle fiber. So here's text form. The action potential is transmitted along the motor neuron to the neuromuscular junction and needs to travel across the gap, the synapse, to get to the muscle fiber. ACH is secreted from the vesicles at the presynaptic membrane into the synapse. ACH enters the vesicles on the other side of the synapse on the muscle fiber, and if enough is received, an action potential is created and the muscle fiber will contract. This action potential spreads into the muscle fiber down T tubules and triggers the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now we'll learn a little bit more about that later. This long phrase basically is a store of calcium, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is critical to enable the sliding filament theory to make muscles contract. Once that's happened and the impulse has gone, what we want to do is kind of mop up all this ACH, this neurotransmitter, and get it back into the vesicles. And that is done by this enzyme, acetylcholinesterase. Now that's very much icing knowledge. The rest you must know. This is icing knowledge. So once the action potential is gone, acetylcholinesterase is released and breaks down ACH, and the synapse is ready to go again, and the vesicles are kind of reset for the next impulse to arrive down the motor neuron. So let's have a look at the two questions we've had so far on this topic. The muscular system works with the nervous system to produce muscle contraction. Explain the role of acetylcholine during muscle contraction for 3 marks. So you've kind of got to state what it is. It's a neurotransmitter, where it works in relation to the nerves and muscles, and what its function is. And they've given you a few different versions of what you could say. So you've got to acknowledge it's a neurotransmitter, really. It happens at the neuromuscular junction. It's released there. And its job is to transmit the nerve impulse. It's a neurotransmitter from the nerve to the muscle to make it contract. You could say it initiates the release of calcium ions on the other side once it gets there. So nice 3 marker there on ACH. Another question. A neuromuscular junction is essential for muscle contraction. Describe what happens at the neuromuscular junction to allow muscle contraction to occur. Again, 3 marks. So it's asking you to give 3 marks worth of that story, how the information gets across, how the impulse or action potential gets across the synapse. And you can see from the mark scheme there that you can get, plenty of marks from that. You only need 3 correct answers, and there's lots that you could offer there.